On the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome Nico Hines. He's the London editor of the Daily Beast, and we are talking to him in London at the moment. Nico, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
This story is incredibly disturbing that you've published in the Daily Beast. I guess it was about a week ago. It is about a VIP pedophile network that was, I guess, I don't know, embedded is the right word, but it was within the British government. Tell us how this story came to light.
Well, how it's come out is a really important part of this whole alleged cover-up. All the way back in the mid-1980s, there were allegations and rumours about senior members of the British government and about what they may or may not have been getting up to in their private time. You have to remember this was a very different world back then. Homosexuality had only been legalised relatively recently, and the age of consent was 21. So there was a kind of a shadowy gay world in any case. So some of these kind of more serious or I shouldn't compare the two, but because there was a veil of secrecy and a veil of criminality around some people's private lives, this was somehow allowed to go on unchecked. Yet there were rumours. Now, media, newspapers, some of whom tried to cover this at the time, but they were never able to, either because the police rushed in to stop them, or just because of Britain's very strict libel laws. If you're going to make an accusation that somebody was breaking the law and in such a serious way, you have to have a lot of proof in order to be able to back up your assertion.
Now, so this scandal, or I should say this pedophile network. We're not talking. I mean, are you saying that we're talking about 20-year-olds, and it is, or are we talking about young children here?
No, we're talking about people from the earliest age that I've seen in allegations that have gone to the police about 9 years old. So yeah, we're talking about serious claims. The reason I mention the older people is just because it gives some context to understand. There was a place called Dolphin Square, which is located near Westminster, near the Houses of Parliament, and a lot of MPs lived there because obviously they have their main homes in the parts of the country that they come from and that they represent. But when they're in London to do political business, they have flats in this place. And it was known that there were some gay parties that had older people in them that were partially secret. But what is now being alleged is that there were, in fact, serious paedophile rings also operating in this block of apartments.
Okay, so let me just see if I can clarify your point here. Is that because this was at a time where there was, I guess, essentially gay people were emancipated in some way, at least in the context of the law, that there were still sort of these vestiges of a social, I guess, perspective where you don't really look into what's going on in the personal lives of people because what they may be engaged in may be technically illegal but is not necessarily problematic. And some of that, I guess, modus operandi sort of intersected with what was which was clearly a different species, i.e., pedophilia. But those sort of constructs were still sort of like were blurred because of that.
Exactly. It just gave a cover story. So you knew that people, MPs, senior MPs who worked for the Margaret Thatcher government, were going off doing things that they didn't want everyone to know about. But you just kind of assumed that it was something that was technically illegal or perhaps frowned upon, or, this was a time when there weren't publicly gay MPs. So you just imagined that what they were doing was actually perfectly reasonable behaviour, even if it was technically illegal. But in fact, it now turns out that there were serious crimes being committed.
Okay, so in 1983, you write, Geoffrey Dickens, a controversial MP. I'm not clear, obviously, as an American, I'm not too up on my on the profiles of members of Parliament, particularly in the 80s, but frankly in the 90s or the aughts, for that matter. But he handed a file containing the names of alleged perpetrators to Leon Britton. Who was Leon Britton?
Right, so Leon Britton is the Home Secretary, which I suppose the most similar position in the US would be kind of Director of Homeland Security or something like that. Someone who's in charge of Britain's police, Britain's intelligence agencies, but also kind of border control. So a very, very, very influential person in terms of someone who was able to put in place, kind of was able to use his influence to make sure that those law enforcement agencies were following his will.
Okay, and so what did he do with this? I guess this file of claims.
Well, that's one of the hotly contested things that's run on this. Now, Geoffrey Dickens publicly said that there was suggestions of there being a paedophile ring in London amongst politicians at the time. Now, most people thought, Geoffrey Dickens was a kind of outspoken, flamboyant kind of a guy. Most people thought he was probably exaggerating or perhaps had got the wrong end of the stick. Nobody necessarily took his claims seriously. Nonetheless, he passed his dossier of evidence to Leon Britton, the Home Secretary, and nothing publicly was ever heard again from that. Now, we subsequently found out that he wrote to Geoffrey Dickens later to explain that his officials did find enough evidence in there to consider it worthwhile to carry out further investigations, but that's the last that we hear about it. The whereabouts of that file is a great mystery. There was an investigation last year ordered by the current British government to try and discover where that file was, and that file has been destroyed. Now, we don't know who destroyed it, we don't know when it was destroyed, but the fact is it is no longer in existence.
Okay, and we should say that this guy Leon Britton, has passed away. I mean, is that why? Okay, and then tell us who Don Hale is, and what was his role in, I guess, this revelation.
Don Hale was a local newspaper editor. He worked in Bury, so outside of London. But the reason he kind of comes into the story is because one of his local politicians, who was a senior Labour politician at the time, went to him and said, look, I've got evidence about these paedophile rings. Now, she wasn't necessarily saying that these people were all active paedophiles, but she was saying that there was a group called the Pedophile Information Exchange, which was working within Westminster, kind of promoting or working to improve rights for paedophiles. She had evidence that these people were working within Westminster, and she wanted the big national press to run a story about it, but they were all too scared to run a story about it. So she went to her local her local newspaper, a guy who she knew well, Don Hale, and gave him that evidence. He was skeptical and at least worried about how he'd be able to use the story, but he thought the least thing I can do is I can run a story saying, well-known local politician Barbara Castle is worried that there's a paedophile ring in Westminster, and she says that it's being investigated by the British government. He thought he'd get away with doing that, so he started to make a few calls to some of those people named in the dossier. No sooner did he do that, but a politician arrived at the office the very next morning, threatening him, shouting at him, demanding that he hand over the files. He refused to hand over those files, and then the very next day, police officers from something called Special Branch, which is a sort of high-up intelligence, Cold War era police super squad, arrived at the office and took away all the papers, took away all the evidence, and said that if he were to ever repeat anything that was found within these stolen documents, that he would be jailed.
Wow. And so he didn't. I mean, how do we know his story today?
Well, he considered, basically he decided that, it was a fair cop in a sense, because he knew that these documents were stolen, or at least were not supposed to have been shown outside of the Home Office. They had, for your eyes only and classified, written on the papers. So he knew that it was true that he could get in trouble if he used them. And he didn't have any way to prove that these allegations were true. So even when he was approached a few years later by the News of the World, a famous tabloid newspaper in Britain owned by Rupert Murdoch, about similar allegations, he refused to repeat them again then, because he was afraid. He had a family, he didn't want to go to jail. It was only when this story began to really explode in 2012 in Britain, when an MP used parliamentary privilege, which means you're allowed to make a claim against an individual that would be considered libelous if it was written in the newspaper or if it was published or discussed on the radio. He used parliamentary privilege to say in the British House of Commons that some of these allegations ought to be examined. And that then kicked into gear the British media into reinvestigating and re-examining some of these things. And the crucial difference is that quite a lot of these men have subsequently died. And so you're now able to repeat some of these allegations, which were never proved in a court of law at the time.
Wow. And so, I mean, and so following, I guess, the member of the House of Commons sort of saying that we need more investigation in this, Hale reports this stuff. Where is it? Where are we now with this? Or I should say, before we get to that, how much did Margaret Thatcher? I mean, how high up did this go?
That's again something that's more and more details of that are emerging as the weeks go on at the moment, because people are plunging back through the archives and finding old reports, finding old classified files, and individuals who were involved with Margaret Thatcher are starting to speak out. So we had one of her bodyguards has come out and said that he warned her about one of her close aides, that lots of allegations have been made against him. We know that Sir Peter Heyman, who was one of the top guys at MI6, one of Britain's main spy agencies, was also caught with paedophile material. We know that she was told about that, and we can see in her hand on a note that was found earlier this year that she says that this shouldn't be made public. And then just this
Wait a second. I'm sorry. What is that last part? Is she found there was a note? Oh, a note that she wrote in her handwriting.
That's right, saying that this shouldn't be made public. So she knew that these allegations had been made. She knew that this guy was responsible not for abusing children, but for having paedophile obscene materials. And she wrote to one of her advisors, "Oh no, let's make sure this doesn't come out." It then emerged this weekend that another of these high-profile abusers, a man called Cyril Smith, and I advise the listeners to look him up, because he's one of the most extraordinary-looking men you'll ever see. Huge, fat man, weighed about 400 pounds, and used to wear kind of these big braces and suspenders. He looked kind of like a cartoonish figure of a bad guy, and it turned out he was a bad guy. Something like several hundred complaints were filed against him by boys over a period of decades. And again, she was warned that allegations had been made against him of this nature, and she went ahead and gave him a knighthood anyway. So he died as Sir Cyril Smith.
So what is happening? I mean, how much is this? I mean, your story, frankly, is the only reporting I've read about this in the States here. There may be other pieces. I haven't come across them. It's certainly not a story that is making big ripples. How big of a story is this in Great Britain? I mean, it just seems I mean, there's two things that seem really sort of shocking to me. One is the cover up. Two is, why are there so many pedophiles in and around these governmental positions? I mean, this is just, it just seems bizarre to me in both instances. But what kind of response are you getting in Great Britain?
It's one of those things that has bubbled and bubbled and bubbled. And it's actually, I think, it's one of the upsides of the internet and people being able to publish information and share information in a way that was never possible before. So what you had in the 1980s and perhaps in the early 1990s was newspapers hearing rumors, hearing suggestions, and perhaps even hearing first-hand evidence from one or two people, one or two victims, that someone had abused them or had broken the law in some way. But not necessarily there being no photographic evidence or there being no video evidence, so it's very difficult with libel laws to be able to report that. But what's now happened is that people who are either survivors themselves or who are kind of self-appointed sleuths have put together a lot of this information into great folders and files and websites where they've collated this evidence. And it's only become apparent that, that there were so many people active at the same time.
But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, well, just because major newspapers were afraid to do it, and because, frankly, as you found yourself, it just doesn't sound believable. It doesn't sound like it could be true. And how could you possibly write that some of the most senior people in the country are pedophiles just based on the word of one or two children who you can't prove are telling the truth?
So is there, in my mind, it would cause me to question two things. One is, just a fundamental question of just, there's all sorts of issues of what else, how many other people are being protected for what and in what dynamic and how long this has been going on, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to address that in a second. But what about the libel laws? I don't know that Americans are quite aware of just how different your libel law situation is in Great Britain. And I wonder if people are questioning the value of those or whether or not they need to be reformed in some way, because the idea that this could go on and people would be afraid of reporting it seems to me very problematic.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A lot of people do think that. There's also a kind of counter-argument. I don't know whether you guys have followed. We've had this big phone hacking scandal over here. And,
Yes.
Rupert Murdoch and a lot of the British tabloids have come under fire for writing too much, making too many fallacious claims about celebrities and about people. So there's also a strong counter movement, as it were. But, I think you can look too much into blaming why weren't the media reporting on this. And perhaps there's a valid point in that. But what the real crux of it is, why weren't the police investigating this? Why weren't these people coming up in court? Because there was evidence. People like Cyril Smith was caught with hardcore pornography in his car and yet was allowed to walk free from a police station because there was a phone call from someone in some high-powered office in London that told the local police officers, oh, do you know what, do us a favour, just let this guy walk on his way.
Has there been any, rethink? Do you anticipate this is going to impact Margaret Thatcher's legacy? And I don't know that it really, I don't know how great her legacy is, frankly, anyways, in Great Britain for that matter. But is this going to impact her legacy? And are people talking about some form of reform within the government structures? There was a quote that you used in your piece, which as I was reading it, I said, this sounds like it would be from House of Cards. In fact, it was a storyline pretty close in House of Cards from basically a whip saying, when members of Parliament come to us with these type of problems, we're excited about it because it means we help them out and now we own these guys, essentially. Is there any talk of we got to figure out a way to make sure that can't happen?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what we have got now, and even this in itself has become a massive problem, is there's an enormous inquiry has been launched into how this was covered up, how this went on, that was announced over a year ago, I think now, and yet has not even sat for a single hearing yet, because there have been so many arguments about who's going to be in charge and who will be able to be responsible for making sure this is an honest and open inquiry. Eventually, they've had to get rid of two panel potential kind of judges who were going to be in charge of it, because it turned out that they were friends or lived in the same neighbourhoods as some of the men who were supposedly caught up in it. So we've now got a judge from New Zealand who's going to be flown over as an independent adjudicator, and it will be her job to go through and to examine how these things were allowed to happen and what should be done in order to make sure that they don't happen again.
Yeah, it's crazy. And it just seems to me, too, that, in this instance, it is pedophilia. But one wonders how many other violations, crimes, scandals are quashed, or investigations of which are quashed, so that these can be used as chits of power in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it happens a lot in the US, perhaps not on these particular grounds, but I'm sure similar things happen. But it's always been worse in Britain, I think, because we do have a different kind of a society here. I don't know if you've seen any of those pictures, school pictures of David Cameron and Boris Johnson, our London mayor, and George Osborne, our top Treasury guy. They were all friends at university. They went to school at similar schools, if not the same school. And we've got a real problem in Britain of a kind of establishment, in a way that I suppose, the Clintons would aspire to, where there's a kind of closed part of society who've known each other all their lives. And yes, when one of them gets in trouble, they're going to close ranks and they're going to try and look out for each other, try and make sure that, not just because they want to do them a favour as friends or as colleagues, but because they think that it would look bad to the rest of watching Britain if it turned out that people who are in this establishment maybe shouldn't be trusted in the way that they are.
It's fascinating, and it just if molesting and abusing small children is not enough to have people in your social circle say we should blow the whistle on this. So one wonders what else they can get away with. But I appreciate your time, Nico Hines. The piece is in the Daily Beast. I presume, hopefully, we'll see more reporting from you going forward on this, because it's just a really bizarre and fascinating, disturbing story. I appreciate your coming on and talk to us about it.
Thank you. If you look out later this week, there should be another piece up on the Daily Beast about a U.S. connection.
Interesting. All right. Well, we will check that out, and of course, we're going to link to your first piece at Majority FM. All right, Nico Hines, thanks so much for your time today.